Good evening, Trinidad and Tobago, and thank you for joining us for night 2 of the virtual National Consultation on Education 2020. I am Matthew Gibbs, and it is my pleasure to join you as co-moderator for this evening's proceedings. This evening, we will be delving into the topic of the Concordat and its relevance in 2020. I would like to now introduce you to my co-moderator for this evening, a face that you're familiar with, Ms. Claire Telemack.
Good evening, viewers, all those at home in Trinidad and Tobago and abroad. As Matthew said, welcome to Virtual Town Hall number 2, as we try to dissect that contentious issue of the Concordat. Tonight, we have with us highly respected panelists who will assist us in the discussion. And I would like to introduce to you Professor Rosemary Bell Antoine. She is a Dean at the Faculty of Law, University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, an attorney, award-winning scholar, international consultant, activist, and chaired professor of labor law and offshore financial law. She's an Oxford scholar with a doctorate in law from Oxford University. She has been a consultant to numerous governments, judicial and international organizations in the Caribbean, and of course in countries abroad, where she has dealt with issues as varied as HIV, education, anti-corruption, the judiciary, and of course human rights issues. Welcome, Professor Antoine.
Thank you. Lovely to be here.
We also have with us here in studio this evening, Ms. Sharon Mungru. She has been an educator for over 40 years, having taught at primary, secondary, and tertiary levels before entering the field of education administration. She has moved from the classrooms to the offices of the Ministry of Education as a curriculum officer, director of the Curriculum Development Division, and chief education officer until she retired in October 2012. Ms. Mungru is currently the chief executive officer of the Catholic Education Board of Management and chairman of the Association of Denominational Boards. So we have with us this evening panelists in studio with a wealth of experience in this area. We also have joining us virtually a third panelist, Mr. James Sammy. Mr. James Sammy is a holder of a master's degree in educational leadership. He's a retired principal who has served as teacher, dean, vice principal, and principal at government secondary schools across Trinidad. Good evening, Mr. Sammy.
Good evening.
Thank you for joining us. And thank you for joining us, Ms. Mungru. So this evening, we're delving into the topic of the Concordat. And I think that, Ms. Mungru, being a representative of the denominational boards, we invite you to give an opening statement on the Concordat and your purpose here this evening.
Thank you very much. And good evening, viewers, those at home, those corresponding with us, and by all means. Let me start by saying that if all the denominational schools close today, then children attending 340 schools in primary and 43 secondary schools will have no school. And for Catholic schools alone, this will deprive some 30,000 primary children and about 10,000 secondary children of schooling. And this is just Catholic schools. The citizens who are part of various denominations own those schools, and they offer a great service to the children of the nation. We did this before there was a government of Trinidad and Tobago, before there was a Ministry of Education. Denominational schools comprise about 70% of the primary system and 32% of the secondary system. And most of you, at some time, would have participated in fundraising for these schools, to build a school, to improve the school, to maintain the school. And you know it. You know the raffles, the harvests, the bazaars, the cake sales, even the carnival fetes. Your great-grandparents and parents probably went to one of these schools because maybe 3 out of 4 people would have attended a denominational school. And there's a reason for this. So let me explain. Denominational primary schools provided the first opportunity after the abolition of slavery in 1834 for the people, the free people, the black, the colored, to have a formal education. Between 1834 and 1838, we had several denominations opening primary schools. The first school, in fact, for free colored children was opened at the corner of Henry and Park Streets in the early 1800s. And it was through the efforts of free Roman Catholic priests. Presbyterian, Muslim, Hindu schools came later. Initially, the denominational bodies bore the cost of erecting the schools. There was no input from the state, and they raised their funds in any way that they could. And by mid-century, they were the only ones still in the field of education. But after 1849, before 1849, government started to give them some funds. But after 1849, as they introduced ward schools, the funding was stopped. In 1870, there were two types of schools established, and it was determined that there would be assisted schools and government schools, all of them public schools. By 1890, it was agreed that the government, making these schools open to all children, would fund 2/3 of the building costs of the school, as well as furniture and some equipment. The condition, of course, was that the school is open to all children, all classes, all races, or religions. The state then progressively began taking more and more of a financial responsibility for the schools. But although now they take a great deal of that responsibility, the schools still spend about $10 million a year in order to maintain themselves.
$10 million a year is a significant amount of money. And this is in addition to the subventions that are given by the government?
In addition.
So that's a lot that we're spending. And this is what education is. It is an investment in our future, but the discussions tonight will surround if this is an investment that is worth or is receiving the returns as is needed. Professor Antwine.
Yes. Good evening, everyone. I believe there is indeed a residual inequity and unevenness in our education system in general, mainly because of class, geographical origin, and so on, and our so-called love of prestige schools, as we call them. But to me, the core issue, the key problem, is not the Concordat itself. That is merely a symptom of a much wider problem, a deeper issue. I think that the state, and notice I said the state and not the government, has failed to upgrade and equalize education as a whole. What we need to do now is to elevate the standards in government, non-denominational schools across the board, wherever they are, focusing on the Concordat, and in particular, the meager 20%, which is usually about 18 children per school, I'm told, of exclusivity, which remains in the denominational schools, is merely avoiding the real problem, and I think it's really misplaced priorities. The state over the years has abdicated its responsibility to provide excellent and equitable education for all, irrespective of class, and now we must focus on that goal. If there were excellent schools all over Trinidad and Tobago with equal resources, both human and physical resources, then the issue of the Concordat would not even arise. Because as it stands, everybody wants a place in the denominational school because why? They are seen as having higher standards and highly successful. And when we look at the Concordat itself, what we can see is that, of course, as my colleague here did say, it's really their schools, their land and so on, their resources. And sometimes we criticize it, but we fail to understand that equality does not necessarily mean identical treatment, even in law. So I think there is room for religious difference, especially in pluralistic societies like ours. There are competing rights and interests, of course, and these must be balanced. However, I think that there are some issues that need to be monitored. For example, the hire of teachers. In terms of the case law, we see that there are different religions should not automatically be excluded. So, for example, you don't need to have a Catholic teacher in the school. I'm not saying there is. I'm just saying this is something that in a modern human rights-based environment we should look at. And also the question of competing religious rights. Remember the case with the hijab, the child who wanted to wear a hijab. So the Concordat, we have to look at these issues today, but I suspect that today these issues may not arise in such a, I think we have progressed, in other words, and it's not exclusive to denominational schools, because we had a Rastafarian boy just recently in Jamaica being forced to cut his locks, had nothing to do with religion. So I think going forward, we must take a principled but very pragmatic approach to education. If we take away the little paltry 20% that they have, then what would be the point? They might actually return to a system of solely private schools, which is a very elitist system that we used to have before when we invited them to partner with us. And incidentally, the 80% is egalitarian, anybody, including the underserved. We do have private partnerships, private public sector partnerships in business. And I think we can continue. We could have a situation, and this is my final point in my opening statement. We do have a situation that I've observed in Trinidad and Tobago of parents wanting to send their children to private schools anyway, primary schools, private primary. And if we were to probably take away too much from the denominationals, then what would be the point of them even partnering? They may just go completely private, and some people who are wealthy would pay. And I don't think we want to go that. So there's a place for the Concordat. And I think we need tolerance, compromise, and of course, sensitivity to human rights.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So there's a place for the Concordat, sensitivity towards human rights. So we have heard the religious perspective. We have heard the legal perspective. Now we are going to hear from Mr. James Sami, educator of long-standing, served in our government schools as administrator. And we want to hear about the school level and the administrative perspective. Mr. James Sami.
Thank you, and good evening, everyone. It's interesting that we started talking about inequity. And if you get me started on that, well, I could go for days. But today we are talking about the Concordat. So let's stay there. When we examine an agreement, and that's what the Concordat was, an agreement in 1960, between two parties. Before we talk about change, before we talk about effectiveness, I believe we need to take a bit of history. We need to go back to the time when it was created and remind ourselves of the reason why we saw it fit to have a Concordat in the first place. Remember that prior to 1960, most of the schools providing for our population were in fact members of the school boards, the denominational schools. Around that time, the government schools were expanding and increasing in number. I think that the state wanted to create a homogeneous system, a system where the education would be the same throughout, and also that the state could have learned from these long-standing institutions. That's why we had to have this agreement. What did the denominational schools gain? Well, there was financial resources, building of schools, repairs, and other things. But I think that there were some serious concerns at that time, which we cannot ignore. Remember that we become cultural. After a while, time goes by, eras pass, and we continue doing things because we have always done them. And sometimes we neglect the reason that we started doing these things in the first place. Going back in history then, when the denominational boards would have agreed to form a homogeneous system with the state, there are things that they would have been worried about. If you accept funding, building, repairs, then you must be worried that you may lose ownership of your properties. And I think that was one aspect of the Concordat. Then we must remember that the education in these schools could not be separated from the religions themselves. So I'm sure that the various denominations would have been worried that maybe part of their purpose in education may have been lost, which was, of course, their own particular religious beliefs being taught to their members. Added to that, they would have wanted to have staff capable of continuing the treatment and the teaching of their religious ideals. We cannot underestimate identity, and I'm sure that the religious boards also would have wanted to retain their own religious identity. Their members had to be served. Would they at that time have been afraid that the schools would have become populated by students who were not of their religious standing? I think that would have been a serious concern as well. So that we can see that there were reasons at that time for this document called the Concordat, for this agreement. But time marched on. And after a while, we may have forgotten that there were reasons and just continued doing things as we had done them. This is a concern because we have to examine now whether in the present day, the tenets of the Concordat are being used really to fulfill those ideals. Almost every difference as a government school principal, almost every difference that we experience, almost every difference in treatment, in funding, in so many other items, the immediate answer is the Concordat. And after a period of time, we begin to realize that the Concordat becomes sometimes a convenient excuse for items that are not really included in the Concordat, but simply to allow differential treatment. And we need to be careful about that. Secondly, the religious boards need to be true to the original ideals and the original purposes expressed. Because as a principal myself, I have found that sometimes the tenets of the Concordat are simply convenient, but the original agenda has been lost. Now, I believe that there is a place for that agreement and that document, but I think we need to examine it within the original context, within the original reason that it was given, and make sure that we are still true to those reasons. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sami. And it seems that we have one concurrent theme this evening. The Concordat does have a place, but what does that place look like in 2020? Is it equitable for all? And how will citizens of Trinidad and Tobago redound to the benefits of this Concordat? We're taking a short break and we're coming back to this discussion because I know that many of you want to have your say.
COVID-19 has led to many changes in our lives. Staying at home, coupled with social and economic worries, can increase the risk of experiencing violence in the home. If you know someone at risk of violence, please reach out, support them however you can. Check that it's safe to be in touch. Get information on where they can get help and where they can go if they need shelter and share it with your networks. In case of urgent need, be ready to call emergency services for help. If you are experiencing violence, reach out for help. Connect with trusted family and friends and manage your stress. Make a plan for how you and your children can get help and where you will go if the violence gets worse. There may be hotlines, shelters, and support services that can help you. Violence against you is not your fault, and you deserve to feel safe. Remember, there's never any excuse for violence.
Shub Diwali, guys. I'm Raymond Ramnarayan from your Delina Dan. Be viewing TTT DigiPlay, TTT Live Online, and the digital Facebook for an amazing Diwali experience featuring Raymond and, of course, your Delina Dan and the G3 family. It's going to be fantastic. Happy Diwali. Mwah! Love you guys.
News happens anytime, anywhere. And when it happens, we are there. We report the news in real time. TTT News. Connect.
Welcome back, Trinidad and Tobago. Again, thank you for being with us this evening. And already you have started contributing on Facebook. We're seeing the comments and we're paying attention because this is going to form part of the conversation that we're having this evening. For those of you that wish to participate via call-in, you may call in at 622-4141 extension 4 to share your views and add to the conversation that we're having now. You may also send WhatsApp messages to 776-0440. So now that you have those numbers and we're ready to engage and we're ready to have this conversation, what would the Concordat look like if it is we are to change it, if it is we are to adapt it? Mr. Sammy made some points toward the Concordat. Is it equitable? Is it something that is of use to everybody? Professor Antoine stated that the Concordat has a place, but we need to look at what that place is and how it will look as we develop, especially in this 2020, where we have been presented with a situation that's forcing us to look differently at everything we do. Ms. Telemark, when we on break just now, you were expressing that the way we go forward is different for all of us. The Concordat has to be looked at because the way in which we engage our students, the way we engage our teachers has to be different now. What do you think we can do going forward?
Well, I think that everyone appreciates the fact that the world that we live in today is vastly different to the one that existed 60 years ago. And I believe Mr. Sammy referred to it when he talked about the fact that the original agenda of the Concordat may have been lost, and that the Concordat, as it is expressed now, should remain true to its original purpose. And I think that is a question that we can perhaps toss to Mrs. Mangru to address, in terms of what Mr. Sammy would have said, in the sense that it needs to remain true to its original purpose because he believes that it has been lost.
I wouldn't say that it's been lost. I think we need to remember the Concordat is an agreement between two parties, and so before we think of changing it, it is the two parties who made the agreement that have to be involved in it. Also, because of the savings clause, it does have the status of law, so that the boards have a constitutional right, and even above and beyond the Constitution, they do have a right to the enjoyment of their property. And so we come back to going to what was intended for the property. However, it's been 60 years since we have been practicing the tenets of the Concordat. And there are practices that I do believe need to be examined very carefully. And there are practices that we need to determine whether these are the ones that we want to continue to exist, and whether these, in fact, will take us forward and continue to have us achieving what we want to achieve. And this is not just what the boards want to achieve, because all the boards are citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. So what is it that we want for our country? And how do we use what is at our disposal to do that? And this means this is not just the boards we're talking about. We're talking about all the institutions involved, the relationships with the ministry, with the Teaching Service Commission, with parents. So definitely there's room to look at those practices and to see, stop using the Concordat as an excuse. And let us get into the real issues and look at solutions to real problems.
So we have a comment here on social media that ties into what Mr. Sammy has said and also to what you have said, Professor Antoine. Aaron Smith says, Our education system is driven by class and elitism. From our colonial past, I have been fortunate to attend both a government and a denominational school. Government schools are always at a disadvantage because of a lack of funding. Also, the past pupils associations are well-oiled and assist their alma maters. I assume this is pertaining to the denominational schools. The Concordat has a place because of our multicultural and multi-religious society, but there must be a place where adequate funding can be given to the government schools. Now, as a representative of denominational boards, Mr. Sami, as a principal of a government school, do you think that the funding that is sent to government schools versus denominational schools has a part to play in this inequality that everyone seems to think exists?
Actually, I am of the opinion that government schools actually are as well funded, if not maybe better funded than some of the denominational schools. However, I would think that the problems may not necessarily stem from funding. The problems may stem from the way that we populate our schools. We have to be honest. That comment spoke about elitism, and I think that there is some merit there. The present way that we populate our schools is vastly different between the denominational schools and the government schools. Children who come from certain types of social backgrounds, who may face certain challenges which causes them not to be able to perform well at the primary level, end up in certain types of government schools. Other people who have greater means very often can find ways to get into the denominational schools, whether as members or by other means. It's a fact. And therefore, the funding may not be that which came from the government. It may not be financial. The difference may be in the population of the school, the means, the resources of the population of the different schools.
So, Mr. Sami, the question would be, and I think Professor Belle Antoine referred to it when she spoke about a residual inequity. If it is that we have students, as you say, we are populating our schools differently, is there a case? I believe Matthew asked the question, is there a case for differential funding of those schools where the populations differ vastly from those of the denominational schools? Because if you have populations which need more support...
The question would first arise, though, as to what we want done in our schools. Presently, to my mind, we judge all schools by the same yardstick: academic success, scholarships. We neglect the fact that certain government schools save lives. We neglect the fact that the jobs are vastly different. We neglect the fact that a good school may not always be the school that is the best academically successful. There are government schools that I have been involved in. I was the vice principal of a comprehensive school where the job done with the children is vastly different. You cannot measure even by scholarships or full certificates because simply lives are saved. So if we first are able to change our concept of education, if we first are able to sincerely look at the jobs of different types of schools and accept the fact that all schools are not expected to do the same job, then the funding might suit the job that is being done.
Okay, Mr. Sami, so you see, you've made a very pertinent point, which ties into what the Ministry of Education always attempts to promote, and that is holistic education. The hidden curriculum is one of the most important aspects of education in Trinidad and Tobago. Now, to your point, there is a comment here on social media that states, is the Concordat the problem, or is it the inability of the state to bring our schools up to standard? Professor Belle Antoine, this ties back into the point that you made. So if it is we are to look at the levels of equity or inequity at our schools. What do you think can be done differently going forward?
Oh, and that's exactly it. And that's why I said the state has abdicated its responsibility. And here we have already got to a point where we're saying some schools should do X and some schools should be Y. But we have not even interrogated whether we have allowed the non-denominational schools to really perform, because we pick the best, so-called best students at a point where they're not fully developed because of all the issues with background and their home environment, and we put them in the so-called prestige schools, and then we say, yeah, the prestige schools are the best. So in a way, although I said there's a place for the Concordat, on the one hand, I still agree with that, but and we scapegoat the denominational schools, and we say, oh, as was being said here, oh, you know, the way they populate these schools. They populate their schools exactly how they were intended to populate their schools. 20%, you can do what you want with the 20%, and incidentally, Concordat does not say that you choose the 20% by religion. Eh? You could choose it for the richest person in Trinidad. They could decide that and probably that's what they do, because they get less funding, not more. And I don't know what, just simply, they actually get less funding, not more. The government schools get more. But then you have 80% of persons who compete in the SEA, all right? But what I'm saying is, if we were, this was an experiment, I agree about that was the reason we were supposed to impart the knowledge and the excellence and so, but we didn't. We sat on our laurels. So we never really tried to upgrade the rest of the schools. So we just piggyback. In a way, it's a handicap. Almost it's a handicap. I'll stop there. I'm sure there's a lot more to say. This is 2 hours. Yes.
Ms. Talima?
One of the commentators who called in on Tuesday spoke to the educational philosophy that we hold as a country, and the sense that we need to broaden our view of success, that we cannot measure everyone by the same yardstick. And I think it is something that all of us as citizens need to consider, because although many of us complain about the Concordat and the inequity that it brings, the same people who are selling you that story are the same ones who will want their children going to the denominational schools and will do all that is required to ensure that that takes place. And my question would be, how do we get, as a nation, people to understand that education is more than certification? What do we need to do as a people, whether we serve on denominational boards, whether we work in government schools? What is the way forward to have the country thinking in that, as you said, Matthew, have that holistic view of education as development of the person and all their potentialities?
Thank you, Ms. Talamak. To that point, Ms. Mangru, I pose this to you. Lauren Semper Scott on Facebook has said, finally, the hidden factors that impact student success are means, resources, and exposure. The MOE can approach different mechanisms for equalizing the schools, not just the population, but the staffing. That has always been a topic that is discussed. A lot of people believe that at the denominational schools you get better teachers. Is that something that you agree with?
Yes and no. It depends on what you mean. First, I want to make another point. You know, as we talk equity, the very troublesome 20% is the opportunity to provide that equity. Because the children who would not have done as well in the secondary entrance examination, because of whatever the home issues and so on, are the ones who now get an opportunity to enter those schools. So there's that. The situation with teachers, you know, the Ministry of Education talks one thing. And I'm saying this, I'm very cognizant of the fact that I can stand in either camp. I've taught in a government school, I've been in the Ministry of Education, I'm now with national boards. And to look at the whole thing, I think a lot of talk about the Concordat really makes us move away from examining the real issues. So the teachers, at the secondary level, the principals are allowed to come into the ministry and to select their teachers. We're all selecting the teachers from the same pool of people who present themselves, 1. 2, take a look at the people who are teachers. Take a look at the people in society who are contributing to the society. Notice that they did not all go to those denominational schools. They've been going to government schools for years. They're running our country and running it well. So I know I'm going off a little bit, but one of the things the ministry needs to do is to start recognizing its own schools. Because while on one hand we talk about bringing up the government schools, there are excellent government schools. And there are people graduating from government schools who are providing service, contributing to the society in great ways. Right? I know personally of some. The government schools provide a very, very varied curriculum. But when we give all of the Plutos to the denominational school, and we don't give some of those to the schools that are doing well in other areas, we continue this.
Thank you, Ms. Mungru. We have a caller on the line from San Fernando. Caller, you're live.
Hi, good night. Listen, I am hearing, Mr. Sami said it best. And what I'm hearing now, sense of the Concordat. Listen, we are not saying the Concordat, the existing relationship between government and these governing bodies was supposed to remain subject to negotiated, inevitable changes. And this is what we are trying to discuss, that taxpayers' money, keeping the church in a commanding position in education, even when the position is funded by taxpayers, we are saying that taxpayers' money must not continue to fund or maintain privilege. So what I'm hearing here is a defense and not ideas coming forward from anybody else except Mr. Sami. Thank you.
Thank you, caller from San Fernando. We have another caller on the line. Caller, you're live? All right, so we lost that call. Professor Bella Antoine, would you like to take that comment that was made just now?
Yes, I'm a little confused because I thought Mr. Sami agreed there was a place for the Concordat. In fact, we all did. So I think the caller needs to listen a bit more carefully because these are complex points. But I wanted to ask, though, because I'm here going back to what Mr. Sami was saying, going back to the original purpose of the Concordat. That was the point, I think. We could say that, but be very careful of what you wish for. Because what was the original purpose of the Concordat? The original purpose of the Concordat was a religious sort of freedom and preserving that religious character. Maybe that is nothing wrong with that. But we have to be careful if that is what we really want. This is why I mentioned about a pluralistic society. And in fact, I don't think the religious schools have gone, how should I say? I think they have softened that approach. They have had to because of human rights issues coming in. And again, that is why I mentioned human rights. It has to be adjusted. So you can't expect, for example, in terms of hiring, that only persons who are Catholics will be teachers in the school or only people who are Hindu and so on, not in a modern environment. These are some of the tweaks.
You have a call on the line, Professor Antoine. Good evening, caller from Tacarigua.
Hi, good evening. I wanted to find out if I understand that the Concordat allows the denominational schools to select 20% of their Form 1 intake who do not meet the cutoff point to enter the schools. Is that correct?
Yes. 80% and then 20% they have. Yeah.
So then what you are saying is that the 20%, let me say it's 15 children. You all hearing me?
Yes.
Well, the 20% selected, let's say the number is 15 children. Then 15 nameless, faceless children on the SDA list would be pushed down the list who otherwise would have gotten through to their first or second choice had the board not given the power by the Concordat to select their own 20%. That is what you all are saying.
That's not what we are saying. That's what the agreement is.
Okay, so the agreement then is a form of state-sanctioned discrimination against those nameless, faceless children who would have gotten into the denominational schools had the Concordat not given them the privilege to push them down the list because they, on the basis of merit, should have been the ones to get in. But the Concordat gives the board the right to discriminate against them.
Okay, caller, so there may be a little bit of misunderstanding of the role of the Concordat. In the selection of the 20%, and according to the agreement that was signed in 1960, the agreement allows for the preservation of the religious integrity of the school. At the end of the day, the schools belong to the denominational boards. So we have to expect that they would have some say in the population of their schools. The government places 80% of the students that attend these schools, which is a significant number. So for the students, for the population, for anything, for the schools to be allowed to have 20%, I think we can't really call that discrimination. That is fair. And I mean, if they had said 50%, that would have still been fair at the end of the day. So to say that their 20% is discriminatory, I think that that is a reach. Ms. Mangru?
I think one of the things that needs to be done is to remove that kind of competition for certain schools by just making the other schools something that people want to be in, right? And instead of everybody trying to funnel their children into a small percentage of schools, a small number of schools, there are other schools that are good and that offer subjects that would meet children's interests, their aptitude, their abilities, advertise more, start a marketing campaign for the other schools.
Thank you, Ms. Mangru. We have another call on the line. Faizabad, you're live.
Hello, good night.
Good evening.
Good night to members of the panel. Hello?
Good evening. We're hearing you.
Yes. I want to say that a lot of the issues that we are discussing, we seem to focus on the 20%. The 20%, as Professor Bellantwine said in her opening statement, is just a meager sum in the total of students who go into Form 1. The Concordat is an issue of an agreement that was signed between the denominational bodies, in the first instance, the Catholic Church and the state. And later on, because of legal precedents, the other denominational bodies became part of it. Over the past 60 years, this has now taken the form of legal precedents. If there's a judgment by Justice Sebastian Venter in 2012, where the Concordat was termed to be settled practice, and this agreement cannot be changed by either party. It is an agreement that has now become settled practice in law. And for those who are interested, if you look at Justice Venter's ruling in 2012 in a case between Kamala Jagasa versus the Teaching Service Commission, he spoke a lot about the rights of the denominational bodies as it pertains to the Concordat. We speak about the 20%, but I want to emphasize the denominational bodies make available to the government our lands and our buildings that are probably valued over billions of dollars. And in return, the government has the right to place 80% of the children in secondary schools and 100% in primary schools. What does the board get in return? We get funding to assist in salaries, funding to assist in repairs and renovations, but that doesn't cover the total cost. The denominational bodies have to raise large sums of money. I think Ms. Mangu said in the beginning last year was $10 million. So over the years, you could work out how much it will be. So I don't think we should be focusing on the narrow 20%. I think Professor Antoine made the point earlier, which I totally agree with. What we should be striving for is to make all schools prestige schools or equal opportunities for all students. But harping on the 20% does not help us. The Concordat is a legal agreement at this time between state and denominational bodies, and we must be looking at improving our schools. The denominational boards have done well. There are government schools that are doing well, but there are a number of issues that we need to look at. But we cannot just, a lot of our problems with the Concordat has to do with lack of information and misinformation. And in this discussion, I would like the panelists to look at the way forward. We cannot just change the Concordat. As I said, it's a legal agreement.
And now we go to a break. We'll be right back.
सही लगता है मैं करता हूं, वो चाहे भगवान के खिलाफ हो, समाज के खिलाफ हो, पुलिस, कानून या फिर पूरे सिस्टम के खिलाफ क्यों ना हो।
COVID-19 has led to many changes in our lives. Staying at home, coupled with social and economic worries, can increase the risk of experiencing violence in the home. If you know someone at risk of violence, please reach out, support them however you can. Check that it's safe to be in touch. Get information on where they can get help and where they can go if they need shelter, and share it with your networks. In case of urgent need, be ready to call emergency services for help. If you are experiencing violence, reach out for help. Connect with trusted family and friends and manage your stress. Make a plan for how you and your children can get help and where you will go if the violence gets worse. There may be hotlines, shelters, and support services that can help you. Violence against you is not your fault, and you deserve to feel safe. Remember, there's never any excuse for violence.
Diwali, a reminder of light overcoming darkness. This is Ravi from the band Karma, inviting you to celebrate Diwali with me. Stay tuned to TTT for Diwali with Ravi as we celebrate light, life, and Diwali. Stay safe and stay tuned. Remember, the night before Diwali, Friday, November 13th at 8 p.m.
TTT News. Connect.
And welcome back, viewers. The discussion has been intense. The comments keep coming in and the calls keep flowing. Right now, we have a call on the line from Marival. Caller, you're live.
Hello, good night.
Good evening.
Yes, I'm calling opinion on the opinion on the education system. Right. I remember while going to school, I grew up in a home. I grew up in a home where I had a single mother. My father died. I didn't grow up with a father.
Caller, if you can load the TV or the device in the background, please.
Right. Is this good enough?
Yes, we're hearing you better now.
Yes. I grew up in a home where I had a single mother, no father, and she had about 2 children, so it was more or less struggle for survival. And when you think about, we didn't have a fair opportunity of education. And when you think about she trying to get by on a daily basis, it have a lot to do with social issues going on in the home that doesn't give a child the right to pursue this education that you want to pursue. Because I remember fighting in my standard 5 class to make the mark. You're trying your best to do the work and you're not getting to do it. The teacher telling how your child have a short attention span in the class. And it all contributes to my father. He used to smoke the weed and it had damaged the fetus in the belly. So I had this short attention span in school. So it's not like, you don't want to do your best. You want to do your best. And I think it should have things in place. So even though a child don't want to do the schoolwork, but like a skill, you pull away because there's some children that do not into the books at all. You understand? They're not into the books at all, but they do have those things where you could just say, okay, this child is in standard 4 or 5, the child don't want to go to school, but let us put this child into a skill where this child could have an opportunity to handle their story when they come out of school, even though they do have these subjects. And then what I'm talking about then now is where the parents need help, because single mothers, they need help. No father to come to give them X, Y, Z. And then they've been turned down as a grant to help them when the man come to school. Child father in there, they have to look all about to find his father. And it's still going on. You don't know where the father is. You understand? So that is how the society ending up with these children. Some of them are at the bottom because they don't even have a cup. I remember going to school and not a cup of tea to drink sometimes and all. Sometimes when I just like pain.
Well, thank you. And we appreciate that the socioeconomic aspect of education and how that impacts students' success and ability to transition into a denominational school, a prestige school. I'd like to pass this question over to Mr. Sami. You came from the senior comprehensive system, as you informed us earlier, which had a lot of skills training opportunities. Can you speak to socioeconomic factors and how that may impact equality in education?
Certainly, and I'm glad you asked me that question. But first, I would just like to clarify two little points made earlier. Sharon, I'm sorry, Ms. Monroe, I'm sorry that we took so long. I was vice principal at a government school for 5 years and principal for 13 years. For those 18 years, I was never allowed to choose a teacher from any pool. We were always sent the top candidate on what is called merit list. So government schools do not choose teachers. Secondly, I'm a Presbyterian. I'm well aware of the 20%. But I want to say this, and I'm not tarnishing the Presbyterian Church. Ms. Monroe had alluded to the fact that 20% in fact allows less advantaged children entry. But I take a little issue with that, because the fact of the matter is that the students with lower marks who get in, by and large, are not from the lower socioeconomic bracket. In fact, very often, they are the elite who did not perform as well academically.
All right, thank you, Mr. Sami. We'll get back to you shortly. We have a caller on the line from Cuba. Caller, you're live.
Hello, good night.
Good evening.
Good night, panel. Good evening, panel. I would
Good
just like
evening.
to give a little view from a teacher's perspective. Yes, I agree that we need to make some educational changes, but we need to look at certain things. We need to look at the multiple intelligences of children. Different children have different needs. Success is not only academic. We can allow children to reach their highest potential and still be the best chef, the best painter. We look at the child and we try very hard to make that child realize their ability. So yes, we need to make some changes in the education system, but not all prestigious schools would you get academic success of every child. I have been a student of a government school, a primary school, a secondary school. I've been a teacher for 31 years. Meanwhile, we have our own desires. I did not go to a prestigious school, but I did get my bachelor's, I did get my master's in education, and I did get my doctorate in leadership in education. So from this perspective, I think that we need to update our thoughts. We need a holistic education. We need to look at each child. We need to look at the social, economical, emotional, financial, the physical. And in each child, we need to recognize strengths. Most of all, we need to look at the leaders. Who are the leaders that are leading these primary schools, these secondary schools? Are they really qualified? Do they really carry on what the Ministry of Education is asking them to do? Are teachers motivated? Because from my perspective and from my research, I can tell you, if teachers are not effective, you would not get the results that the Ministry of Education wants. And to make teachers effective, you need to have effective leadership in the schools, starting with the principals, vice principals, the head of departments. If we don't have this, if they don't have a transformational leadership in this time to lead students into the 21st century, then it does not matter which structure you change. It's not going to work. We need to fill the gap.
Thank you very much, caller. Well said, and you illustrate well that success does not only derive from attending a prestige school. And you have raised a number of points about leadership, about the teachers in our schools being motivated, which brings us back to the point that I think Mr. Sami alluded to earlier, that of staffing of our schools, government schools versus denominational schools. I believe that after the selection of the 20%, the staffing, the ability of denominational schools to have some control over the selection of people who enter their schools is one of the most contentious issues, particularly for those who have worked in government schools all their lives. And I would like us to look at that issue, and I think we will start with Mr. Sami as he worked in a government school, because government principals in particular feel a sense of disadvantage.
And thank you, Ms. Telemac. We have a caller on the line from Barataria. Caller, you're live.
Yes, good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening to the panel, yeah. Very interesting. I think Mr. Sami, Mrs. Mangru, they have made some pertinent points. But as my preamble, one would need to check, for example, that recent publicity with this doctor of medicine, right? If you were to do a background check in his educational, background, and to some extent, the curriculum would have molded and shaped. It shapes all of us to who we are. So somewhere along the lines, and that is the one that has surfaced. So even professionally, something would have failed the system. That's just my preamble. So what I wanted to talk about is other than the Concordat, strengthening the curriculum. At one time there was a vocationalizing of the school's curriculum where TVET was offered. You're not hearing much about TVET in these sessions here. I recall that, for example, in recognizing excellence, national scholarships were given in the academics, TVET, the craft and technician programs, even teacher education, a wide cross-section. And you know what? They were all announced at the same time and printed in the front page of the newspapers. All of them got President's Medal. That was a ministry's policy, which has just disappeared. So there was that equity in bringing up certain non-academic types of in the curriculum. So that is one of the points I wanted to raise. What has happened to that policy in terms of awarding excellence and the non-emphasis of TVET in the school system? I know you had the CBQs and so on, and but there was the part-time programs in the comprehensive school. They have very good workshops. Now this COVID-19 has allowed you actually a lot of the teaching learning now has to take place virtual. Why can't we? So we're getting some of the best teachers now broadcasting different subject areas through the multimedia. Why can't we have, let's say, like campuses of secondary schools? I recall at one time Mr. Pantin, when he was the principal at Fatima, he annexed Mokorapo Comprehensive with the college, because that the students could benefit in the vacation period from the workshops. The workshop facilities, you have excellent workshop facilities, and they don't exist in the non-natural schools. So if you want to produce, for example, excellent engineers, they need to have that training, and the facilities are available in the formerly what you call the comprehensive schools. So why can't we have like campuses of secondary schools where you can network even among the teachers in the various subject matters? So we need to reorganize the secondary school system. And as I said, have that curriculum, strengthen the curriculum, widen the curriculum, include sporting academies, include, cultural academies at the secondary level, and you could still have the CXC and other examining bodies examine, because in cricket, for example, in sports, you could have the psychology of sports, the engineering of sports, and it can lead up to the professional level in sports medicine.
Thank you very much, caller. You made some very pertinent points that we have a lot of our panelists shaking their heads in agreement. We have some comments here on WhatsApp that I'd like to share with the panel. From Ahmad Diobaran, offer more recognition to government secondary schools in terms of scholarships and positive social imaging. Highlight the successes since those schools are indeed producing citizens that are adding value to Trinidad and Tobago's human resource. Use a system of distribution and more media coverage. We have another comment that says, that's the issue right there, the labeling of prestige schools. So the only mentioned government secondary schools are QRC, etc. But St. James Secondary, Woodbrook Secondary, and many other government secondary schools are not treated with the same esteem, though they are maybe doing equally or better than with their student output. Take away the prestige stigma. Do we need vocation-type secondary schools or varied choices for secondary schools to make education experiences fuller for all? There was also a recommendation via WhatsApp. Can the leadership and philosophy, educational philosophy, and programming be replicated at the government secondary schools that's being done at the denominational schools? Ms. Mungru, I'd hand that question over to you.
And the leadership?
Can their leadership philosophy, educational philosophy, and programming be replicated at a government school?
So we're talking about the culture of a school. Because, in fact, the government schools have people who have the same qualifications as the denominational schools at this time. There was a time when the denominational schools did not get as many graduate teachers. But we're talking philosophy, and a lot of it really is tied in to faith. It's tied into people's faith. It's tied into the religious values. So, yes, you can, and I think that gets to the heart of the differences between the schools. At least it's one of the big differences between them. Can it be replicated? I don't think it's impossible. I think it's very, very possible, but it will take some work.
A question. One of the callers had referred to the fact that we need to strengthen and widen the curriculum. One of the comments that I've often heard from persons in the education system is the fact that those prestige schools, the denominational schools, preach a holistic type education, but for example, their curriculum does not include technical vocational education. What's the denominational schools' perspective on that?
It can to a certain extent, because to have tech voc education, you need to have certain facilities available. The facilities must reach certain standards. So that as far as they're able, there is a move. I'm thinking right now that I think there's one of the, is it Naparima? Oh. No, sorry, it's the Hindu schools that are putting in swimming pools, right? So as far as they're able, they can do that. But Mr. Sami made a wonderful suggestion, which is annexing schools to those that have the facilities. And it is something that I think we need to explore very, very much more.
Thank you, Ms. Mungru. Now, what has come up is the fact that this national consultation on education is critical at this point in time. We realize that even though we're discussing the Concordat, there are several different issues that have come forward. The issue of technical vocational education and skills training has just reared its head on more than one occasion based on the comments that we've received. The idea that equitable education needs to be accessible to all. And these are all topics that will be explored in our coming consultations. So I do hope that Trinidad and Tobago tunes in as we go forward. Now to you, Professor Antoine, based on what you started with your statement, your opening statement saying, and where the conversation has gone thus far, is there anything that you think can be done differently?
Well, listening to my colleagues, I mean, I'm very heartened. I agree. We can have knowledge transfer because I agree with you. Some of it is the culture and of course tradition over many, many years, which was probably started with the religion, but now has probably gone broader. So I do think that is one of the things that can happen. And we didn't get a chance to explore the staffing issue, but I do think that's important as well. That I am not saying to take away some element of choice in terms of staffing with denominational schools, but we have to ensure that principals have a say. They may want to define their philosophies in the government schools and so on, and they should at least have some say as well. And I go back to, and this is a legal point as well, that, you know, we have had cases elsewhere, maybe not so much religion, but both religion and race. For example, there's a famous case about Brixton Cultural Center, that they hired a non-black person.
I'm going to ask you to hold that
Yeah,
point.
a call,
Hold
yeah,
that. We have a
okay.
caller on the line from St. Clair. Caller from St. Clair, you are live.
Hello, good evening.
Good evening.
Okay, so I have 4 points. One, I heard someone say
Caller,
that...
just advising you, the 4 points need to be summarized in 1
yes,
minute
very
and 30
briefly,
seconds.
yes, that's what I'm doing. So
All right, thank you.
taxpayers, someone said that the taxpayers have supported the denominational school. I'm just here to say that the 20% of the children who go into the denominational schools, which is about 18 to 30 children per year, their parents are also taxpayers, and all children are, you know, allowed to have an education and to have teachers and stuff like that. I need to dispel the myth that if you can't do academics, you can do a trade. Because to do a trade, you need to be able to do some mathematics, language. You need to have actually more skills to do a trade than to do academics. I also want to point out that roughly 18,000 plus SA students, get to the exam every year. Of that, 480 students, which would be the 20% of the denominational schools, are who go into those secondary schools. Is it that we're saying that 17,520 children are being displaced because 480 children were allowed a place on a 20% list in a denominational school? I beg to differ. I think that we need to improve our education system for all so that everybody, parents, students, teachers, can be prestige parents and prestige children and prestige adults in prestige schools. Have a good evening.
Thank you very much. Professor Antoine, you want to finish your point or you want to contribute to what was just said?
Well, I mean, she sort of said earlier on, so I obviously agree with what she said. But I mean, you just have to look on the television every week. And I sympathize with I know about the fundraising from the convents and so, of course. But I think, especially if you're in a school in a rural area or in a low-income area, your resources are really terrible from what I can see in Trinidad and Tobago. And how could those schools perform in any way comparable to the denomination or so-called prestige schools? I mean, we really need more equity across the board, both on the home level, and someone spoke very eloquently about that earlier, and also in terms of the school's resources, and I would add my voice to some element of control in terms of the staffing.
Thank you, Professor Antoine. We have a call on the line from Maloney. Maloney, good evening.
I know to all the program, right? So, but I have an issue where it comes to the Zooming with the teachers, because I have a grandson who is going to La Hokata, and he now starts school, and because of the teacher not Zooming at all, he don't believe it's really schoolwork, that is just his mother giving him a lot of schoolwork. We kind of rebelling, and we try to talk to the teacher that, even if it's to Zoom the class, or as before she used to do, just say present, miss, in the morning, like 2 hours, 4 hours, or just let them teacher.
Thank you, caller. So there are many different aspects of education that we have to look at. We're talking about holistic education. We're talking about equity in education. And Mr. Sami, you were making some points earlier and we had to move to a caller. So I want to hand back over to you to finish the point that you were making, because you were talking about the staffing at our schools and how that works at the government secondary school level.
Yes. One of the things that I've noticed is that we continually use the word education, yet we continually talk about training and certification. I want us to remember that education, while it involves training and certification, is far more. And in my initial comment, when I spoke about the different jobs done by different schools, I believe we need to recognize what education is all about, building a citizenry, building competent individuals, not just about passing exams and being certified. in terms of the government schools and the stigma of the prestige schools, the only people that we can think about to change that situation is the general population of the country, not the government, not the denominational boards. They are doing an excellent job. It is us, the population, who gives that prestige status and who are unwilling to want our children to go to certain government schools. I want to say that success in life has many, many different routes. I'll give you an example. I was principal of St. George's College. Coming out of St. George's College, we have Nadia Batson, Voice, Irfan Alves. They didn't win scholarships, but they are happy and successful. A boy did badminton at St. George's and is now playing badminton in Denmark. His name is Naeem Mohammed. There's a young lady called Shanice Charles who did martial arts and now competes in Europe. Are these children not successful too? And most government schools can talk about students who become successful in these ways. Do you remember Dexter St. Louis, our table tennis phenomenon? Dexter St. Louis went to Shagwana Senior Comprehensive School and played table tennis there. So when we talk about education,
Thank you, Mr. Sammy.
when we talk about success, let us not confine ourselves.
Caller from
only
Arima, you are live.
Good night.
Good
Thank
evening.
you to the panel and to your listening public. I wanted to say that there's a segment that for the short time I've been listening to the program, children are part of the equation, and there are students who have been misbehaving when we had school face-to-face, and we've had students who are also misbehaving on the computer while it's being virtually taught. And I think because of the different varying backgrounds and family interventions and lifestyles, we may be seeing how these students don't behave well. They can be very disruptive in class, and it's important that we also tackle that issue, that these teachers are given the support by the social workers and psychologists and so on, and that the government should ensure there's enough staff to deal with that. What was pertinent a few years ago when the Minister Garcia had some people from Central, they took about 50 students, if I remember correctly, during that July-August 5-month time, and there was violence in the school, and they were able to rehabilitate them and reintroduce them into school. And things are happening in primary and secondary schools that are where there's drugs, where there's sexual behavior, whatever, and we are not tackling those things. So no matter how good the schools are, the teachers are, the structure is, the students will not, there will be a segment of students who will not be doing well. I've heard of even prestige schools having their issues, but not coming out to the fore. So I think we need to have the support systems from the psychological, the social, because these students who are not groomed well, they are grooming to become criminals coming out there. And that's my contribution.
Thank you very much, caller. There are many, many, many topics that we have to discuss in education, and we will be exploring them over the coming weeks. Tonight, as we discuss the Concordat, we're getting ready to wrap up, but we want to hear from you. So you have a few more minutes left to call in. We now go to a short break, and we'll be right back.
Diwali, a reminder of light overcoming darkness. This is Ravi from the band Karma, inviting you to celebrate Diwali with me. Stay tuned to TTT for Diwali with Ravi as we celebrate light, life, and Diwali. Stay safe and stay tuned. Remember, the night before Diwali, Friday, November 13th at 8 p.m.
The festival of Diwali is a very sacred time for our Hindu community and our country. It symbolizes the spiritual victory of good over evil, knowledge over ignorance, and light over darkness. Today, that light stands as a beacon of hope to many. This year, as we celebrate Diwali amidst a global pandemic, my hope is that the significance of this festival shows each of us that there is victory ahead. As each diya is lit, the light that illuminates acts as a reminder that despite our circumstances, darkness can be driven away. Diwali has long brought us together despite religion or ethnicity, as it embodies a deep sense of joy, respect, and appreciation for our rich cultural diversity. Let us continue this tradition, even as we celebrate in our homes and smaller gatherings. May the blessings of Mother Lakshmi bring you hope, health, and enlightenment. Shubh Diwali.
This was a production of the Office of the Prime Minister, Communications.
Shubh Diwali, guys. I'm Raymond Ramnarayan from your Delhi Nadan. Be viewing TTT DigiPlay, TTT Live Online, and the digital Facebook for an amazing Diwali experience featuring Raymond and, of course, your Delhi Nadan and the G3 family. It's going to be fantastic. Happy Diwali. Mwah! Love you guys.
Welcome back, viewers. And as we continue the conversation on the Concordat and its relevance in 2020, we move to a call on the line from San Fernando. San Fernando, good evening.
Good evening again. Listen, the issue is really, since the Concordat was a cabinet decision and not parliament, maybe this Concordat changes should be done in the parliament. And this is just a suggestion. And you see, it's not a matter of the 20%. The thing is that the 20% supposed to be allocated, provided that the pass list of SEA seeks to provide those pupils. And that, I think, is the issue. Where the 20% coming from, it is from the pass list. And whether this Concordat now, given the interest, should be taken to the parliament as opposed to the cabinet. Thank you.
Thank you very much, caller. There's a comment that I think would be of benefit to all, and this can be discussed. We must put concerted attention into developing fair and clear measures of the quality of our schools. Some government schools are excelling, but there's no mechanism to identify their great practices and make this knowledge shareable with other schools. The real challenge is to make every school a good school, and we will not know where we are on this journey unless we can measure school quality. The number of scholarships is not a metric of measure of a school and does not tell us anything meaningful. Now, Mr. Sammy made that point before about the academic performances of a school and measuring that as a good school. But I'd like to toss that over to you, Professor Antoine. Do you have a perspective on that?
On scholarships?
On academic performance making a school a good school.
Well, I just created a couple of years ago a scholarship to get into law, which is based purely on activism. So that tells you what I feel, and so far it's attracting people, and that's what people would not normally get in because of the so-called pure academic performance. Because I strongly believe, especially in our system, and especially the inequities throughout the country that we all seem to agree on, you don't necessarily get the so-called brightest people at the point in time that you want them. People develop at different paces. So I do agree that we can widen the notion of success, but more than that, we can do a better job of harnessing persons from all over the country who can be successful and be better developing them.
Thank you, Professor Antoine. We have a caller on the line from Arima. Arima, you're live?
Good night to the panel.
Good evening.
Thank you for inviting me. With the relevance of the Concordat, if I understand it correctly from what I believe Mr. Stammy said and another caller said, that the community of each denominational body may have obtained the land, built their schools, set up their own system of teaching, and then somewhere down the line, as years went by, they worked along with the government. Here's what. we want to be able to get students into your schools too, while they expanded the schools throughout the country. If that is so, here's what. If I build my institution as a denominational group to have my students from my congregation come to the school, and I now make a new agreement now with the rest of the population through the government to have other students come in, then the Concordat is an agreement between the two that I will still have my school, my property, and so on. So that I think the Concordat is still relevant in this day and age because it's still the denominational schools property, and they run their board a particular way. And if there are things we can learn from each other, whether we belong to a denominational area or the government schools, the collaboration is necessary. Thank you.
Thank you very much, caller. Now, we are approaching the time where we will be closing this evening's conversations. And we have had some very, very insightful discussions. As the saying goes, time flies when you're talking education, or something along those lines. I would like to invite each of our panelists this evening to give a closing comment on this evening's discussions surrounding the Concordat. I will start with you, Mr. Sami.
I would just say a quote that means a lot to me, that the future of the nation lies in the book bags of the children. And I think it must be understood that it does not mean that the nation wants to have you as a doctor or a lawyer making a lot of money, but simply we want to have citizens who can build a nation. That's why we spend money on education. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sami. We have another caller on the line. Good evening, Diego Martin.
Yes, good evening, panelists. Thanks for the opportunity. I'm a parent of a child who has now entered Standard 5. And these children, I feel, are the ones who would be the most experimental in terms of what doing the SCA and the effects of the Concordat will have on their future. Because here it is, they have been home from since March because of the pandemic, and they haven't had much schoolwork. And now they'll be asking them to do an exam that would determine the whole future. And my thing about the Concordat is this. How could something that was signed 60 years ago, and where the first recipients of the 20% chance are now in the 70s and late 60s and so on, and we're still saying that we shouldn't touch that document. And I'm saying it was something, it was said before by other callers, but it was something that was promulgated when we were a colony. We are now a country 58 years independent, and I'm saying it's time that we take a look at it and break down the inequities that lie in it. And one example I'll give is this. At the time the Concordat was formed, there were less secondary schools. So you are telling me, and if we're saying that the exam has morphed to where every child goes ahead, I'm saying that we could look at the document and find some way to capitalize on the amount of secondary schools we have and make sure that everyone gets a fair chance. You see, the thing is about equity in education and not egalitarianism. And for me, that is what the Concordat represents. We want educational equity. And unless we deal with that, the system that we have now will continue to perpetuate the notion of failure and success in children's education. I think that is unfair. If we want to catapult our country forward, especially with the demands of what the 21st century would mean for this current generation, my child included.
Thank you very much, caller. Equity in education, and we can all agree that that is something that we strive for. Closing comments, Ms. Mangru.
I think we need to stop making the Concordat a distraction and let us deal with the real issues. We're talking equity in education. Let us join forces, all of the partners involved in education, and work together to bring about that equity. Work together so that every child has access to quality education, regardless of what school they attend.
Thank you very much, Ms. Mangru. We have one more call on the line. Felicity, you're live. Caller, can you please mute your device?
Good night to the panel.
Good evening.
Hello? Good night to the panel. I heard Ms. Mangru, and it has been the view.
Caller, can you please mute your device? All right, we've lost that call. We now move to Professor Antoine. Professor Antoine, is there any comment that you would like to close with this evening?
Let me stick to a legal comment. And that is, earlier on it was said that the Concordat, it's law and we can't change it. I would say that is not true. We can change it. If we are ready to admit that we are part of the problem, we send our children to the schools and we want them to go to the schools which represent excellence. If we are ready to democratize education and maybe if we want to secularize it, then we must change it. But my opening statement was your closing statement, Ms. Mango, and we agree fully. We have to ensure that there's equity across the board.
All right, so all of our panelists this evening have identified that equity across the board is something that's needed from all of us. We look to some more of the comments that we have been receiving. We identify that we need to decide what we want from education and then what factors we will measure, how we'll measure them, and then assess the outputs of our schools. It was also stated that a 60-year-old agreement is irrelevant. Trinidad and Tobago is 54 years old as a republic and 58 years old as an independent nation. If this age of agreement is to be valid, should we seek to become a colony of another superpower? We should work together to improve throughout. I agree with the caller on equity in education. So equity in education is a theme that has been running through all evening. So I ask again, if it is we are to say equity is the thing, that is thread that needs to be weaved through, the Ministry of Education has been stating that for us, access, equity, and quality in education is the gold standard. Do you think that the Concordat of Trinidad and Tobago as it stands can deliver on access, equity, and quality? This is the question that we shall close with. I pose that over to you, Ms. Mangru.
I don't think the Concordat should be the one to deliver on access, equity, and quality. It's the Ministry of Education. It's all of the practices that we embrace that will do that. The Concordat really doesn't have anything much to do with this.
Professor Antoine?
I agree. That it's a symptom of a failed system.
And Mr. Sami? Mr. Sami, we're handing over to you. Access, equity, quality at the Concordat. What are your views?
I agree fully with what Ms. Mangru said, that we need to stop making a scapegoat out of the Concordat itself and look at everything that we do in education to make our system whole and unbroken. I don't think it's just the Concordat, and I don't even think the Concordat is a major factor. Thank you.
And my final statement would be the fact that all of us, as citizens of Trinidad and Tobago, need to understand, as Mr. Sami alluded to, what education ought to do for the development of Trinidad and Tobago. What is an educated person in Trinidad and Tobago? And that all of us need to broaden our view of success. Because if we broadened our view of success, all of us would not be rushing to ensure that all our children get into the so-called prestige schools. We need to recognize achievement in all its forms and recognize the fact that children can contribute regardless of their gifts. So all of us have a part to play in ensuring that our views of education contribute to the transformation of the system.
Thank you, Ms. Telemac. And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen, the viewing public of Trinidad and Tobago. This has been the National Consultation on Education 2020 Night 2, where we discussed the Concordat. The conversation does not stop here. You can continue to submit your feedback and give any perspective that you have on matters of education via our email platform at educationconsultation2020@moe.gov.tt. If you have written suggestions, you can submit them at the education district offices at the boxes provided, and you can visit our social media pages or the Ministry of Education's website at www.moe.gov.tt/NCE 2020. thank you for your contributions and thank you for joining us this evening as we continue to transform education in Trinidad and Tobago. Ladies and gentlemen, transforming education, it takes a village. Have a great evening.